Yes, we hear you. You hear us? Okay. Yes, we can hear you, Scott. Go right ahead.
All right. So, for those of you who are here today, I'm Scott Yokel. I'm Director of Research Computing at Harvard. And I was going to share a little bit with you about the Campus Research Computing Consortium, give you a short little overview of what that is, and then about a little bit of the work that went on last March. There was a CI professionalization workshop that one of the working groups, the professionalization working group, or I should say like worked on, and myself and Patrick Schmitz from Berkeley were a big part of doing all the pre-work and helping organize the workshop. So I will also point down at the bottom left here that this this work is a part of a larger effort that was funded a number of years back called Advancing Research and Education Through this National Network of Campus Research Computing Infrastructure, kind of a mouthful. But the idea of some of this early work came from some of these RCN meetings. So the CARC vision, just to summarize it, is, sorry, I'm trying to move the, there you go. The Zoom box was covering up half my slide. The CARC vision is basically for supporting on-campus awareness and facilitation and to do some knowledge sharing between the different institutions. A lot of the concepts of this kind of extend a little bit beyond what the ACI ref type of work that was done between 6 of the institutions for about 3 or 4 years at that point. And so then CARC was born last summer and voted into existence right before PERC 17. So this is the value of identification kind of statement across all the stakeholders. The CARC membership, as it was currently last summer, was these 35 different institutions. And then the next part I was going to tell you about was the value proposition. It's like, why should we have such an organization? And it's basically, we would like to, optimize the use of campus resources, be able to identify like leading practices and provide these back to a broader community. If we can extend domain-specific research computing expertise, that would be very advantageous, especially for places that may not have those expertise on campus. We'd have a community of people to tap into. And then provide the leadership in research computing with a type of ecosystem that would allow for a lot smoother and more open collaboration. So that's the kind of the value proposition. And then, so out of that, there's a number of different working groups. So the one that I've been a part of is this workforce development professionalization that Jim Biles and Thomas Hauser have been leading up. There's a few others, defining stakeholders and value proposition that Andy Sherman and Barr have done. And then there's some other ones. There's this facilitator network, is like, how do we get the people to communicate together and get active in the community? And Lauren from Wisconsin, Dana from Oklahoma State have done that. And then there's also this expertise in research training. So these working groups, they meet for kind of a short duration, try to come up with some type of product, provide the product to the community, and then get some feedback, and then go through another iteration. So that product is what becomes, on this previous slide, that's the kind of the value delivery, is the actual product that we're producing back to the community. RCN conversations from a number of different meetings over the years was, should we or should we not become some kind of, are we a standalone profession? Should we become a professional society? There's a lot of wrestling of those different concepts that a number of different professors that are studying organizational sociology. They were studying us, and we were, the subjects of these studies through these various meetings over a few years. So out of that came the idea that, well, we should take a stakeholder survey as well and send it out and I just wanted to show you, like, there's a good variety of different types of representation in this survey. So we have 250 respondents. Some of you guys might have been a part of this survey. So all the way from the executive leadership to those who are doing the actual boots on the ground work, also including students and facilitators. So it's a good, I think, representation. So Joel provided a long detailed thing of this at the PERC 17 workshop on CARC's like formation. I'm just going to show you 3 different slides of some of the results. So the slide on the left is talking about how important this topic is of workforce development. And then the different colors that you're seeing are the different representations of the different groups of people who took the survey. So whether it's the leaders, right, or it's the facilitators, or research computing leadership, like your director levels, people who are doing software development, or the IT services would be all the system administrative type. Anyway, so across the board, it's high on the left of how important it is, and how challenging it is the effort that's required to make some momentum and change in this. So it's this gap between these two things. If it's really large, that means, you know, it's difficult and really important. So workforce development, supporting facilitators, right? You can see that slightly easier than the workforce development, but still similar importance. And then also the roles and career paths. So one thing you can notice is that the executive leadership doesn't understand perhaps the roles and career path problem quite as much. And it also doesn't seem like it's as big of a problem as the first one, which was the workforce development. So but those 3 things kind of scream to us that we should definitely do something about this. And so what we tried to do is within CARC, within that, we had a workshop, and the workshop was to learn from the leading practices of different CI career paths and try to develop some kind of framework. And this framework would be good for hiring, it could be good for retention, it could be good for those who are in the community to take to their administration and show that there's a broader organization that's going on in this kind of workforce. So in those research computing coordination network meetings for the last couple of years, there's been some dialogue around, well, if we had to say, what do the people do, how should we describe that? So this concept of this term facings came out. And so the idea is to think about the different hats, you know, or roles that you would have while providing some comprehensive research computing as a service to your community. And so you would have to, you know, think about the times in which you have the roles of facing the systems, right? So this, you know, I'll talk about these a little bit more detail, and that was what part of the workshop was for. There's when you face the researchers, so you turn and face the researchers and help them. You may face the actual software or the data. So that means more like you're creating software. This is not necessarily just installation of software. Or you're creating new ways to manipulate data. And then there's like more leadership role, which is facing the institution and the sponsors and the stakeholders. Anyways, and so through this workshop, we also wanted to anticipate any complications or disconnects of this framework. Like, does the framework that we want, you know, once we come up with one, if we were to deliver it across campuses, where would it break down? Where would it hold true? And try to make something that each different institution, knowing the diversity of them, would be useful. And that's a real big challenge. And I think that's important to understand, is that the framework that we provide and stuff has been thought about in that context and should be used kind of in that context. And then the next steps towards utilization of the framework. And that's when an actual product come out. And I'll show you the product in a second. And also, at any point, if like we need to have a discussion or questions around this, I'm happy to be stopped in the middle of this. I have plenty of time for that. So the structure of the meeting was Monday evening, an all-day Tuesday, and then a Wednesday morning kind of check-in. So Monday evening, we had representation from a few different groups that had kind of done this endeavor internally, kind of give us the pros and cons and difficulties and challenges, so we kind of be aware for the next day. And that included University of Minnesota, University of Florida, and a little bit of stuff that we had started to do at Harvard. We're kind of in the middle of this at Harvard, across the whole university. And then Tuesday, the morning, we broke out into those 4 different breakout groups. I should also say the representation, we had an HR representative in each of the groups. Also, 50% of the attendees of the workshop were, I would say, like research computing staff, right? Whether they were directors or mid-level, system admins and CI engineer types. And the other half were folks that were like CIOs or VPs of research or those other administrative roles that support these organizations. We also had, I think 5 or so that were outside of academic life. People from like EDUCAUSE and from Intel, a few others. And then, so we worked on defining the roles and responsibilities in these 4 different groups. And then we did a report back to everybody, and then we had lunch. And then Tuesday afternoon, we did the same thing, but we focused on the talent pipeline. And people were able to move groups at that point if they wanted to. And so the talent pipeline was talking about the education experience and the competencies coming in to perform these roles and responsibilities. And then we tried to talk a little bit, if we had time, about career opportunities, and also just kind of made a list of what organizations and types of things that existed, like the program that you're at this week with the virtual residency, that can benefit you in these different lights, in these different roles. And then overnight, we came back the next morning, and all of our note-taking via shared Google Doc, Joel from Brandeis had magically turned into a document that looked pretty decent. And we talked about the hesitations and cautions around the framework, what would be, the issues of going forward, what would like a flushed out product look like, and then also about how will it be used. And then what happened after that is we had about 12 volunteers to help clean up the document and meet for about 6 weeks in a row that organized a final product so each of the groups looks the same. And we also defined like a couple pages of how should this be used, knowing that a huge community was going to use this that wasn't a part of all these conversations. So we wanted to kind of clue them in. So I'm just going to give you some high level themes that emerge from the different 4 different groups. So in the systems facing roles, so each of these we also came up with a figure that would help in explaining some of these at a higher level. We looked at the systems facing role as kind of a stack approach, where the data center is at the bottom, and as you go up this stack, you're getting less physical and more virtualized in the environment management. So some centers actually have to worry about the physical data center itself, but then some institutions may not. So if you were building roles and responsibilities and to write job descriptions, you may not have to do any of this last part, but you could pick the ones that you would need. And so physical systems, you may make the choice at your own institution that we don't want to do anything physical. We'll have everything on somebody else's physical systems, or you may have some relationship with your central IT that is different, where they maintain that and you maintain the integrity of the software stack, like the operating system and the management environment and the ways in which you provision and the resources via, say, some kind of job scheduler. The virtualized environment could also just be virtual machines or containers. All of that are abstracts on top of the operating system that you provide as an end resource to your researcher. And then there's other things that came out of this that were interesting, is that there's a softer side of skills that are required in the systems facing roles, and understanding how to communicate the changes, develop strategies, maintain relationships with vendors. That's all really important to the acquisition and purchase and evaluation of these different technologies. And then somewhere also involved in this is the different types of security regimes and stuff that are required. Some of this might be the physical security, disaster recovery requirements in some cases. There's also part of this in getting applications environments set up for different like data compliant regimes and stuff. So we felt like a unique enough space to call it out separately. And so in the document, these are single statements like this, and then underneath them there are detailed bullet points. that kind of go in a little more depth. And so for the researcher facing, it's not really a stack. Things don't necessarily build right on top of each other. So we wrote these side by side, kind of more of a spectrum. And so if you have people who are facilitating conversations with researchers, this could be at a single engagement, right? It could be just through a ticket or some chat, or it could be through like an office hour visit. It could be through multiple engagements where you have an ongoing kind of more of a collaborative interaction between the researcher. And so engaging with researchers on this concept of partnering to co-create and co-learn was really important. There was a lot of other discussion around this, and in the document we pulled this concept out. It was something that we wrestled with, and I think there's a little bit of friction in people's engagement sometimes with researchers when they don't feel like they have this potential to co-create and co-learn. And so we did talk about that. So they're in the document itself. It pulls that out as a theme that was talked about. And so engaging with researchers is a really important point. And I think one thing to just mention is that prior to get funding is the time to results. And I think inside the NSF, it's starting to become really evident that there is a group of people that can help accelerate this and become a catalyst for this, especially if equipment was involved and stuff like that. So to facilitate collaboration, it's important that the person that had the researcher role understands kind of all the different services that are being provided within, let's say, their own research computing shop, but also other places on campus or maybe online and other public things, also within national providers like Exceed and Open Science Grid. So it's a really important role to be kind of well versed, and so you can help coordinate their interactions. And it's also good to be a really good communicator. This could be within your own community. It could be across multiple campuses within your region, us nationally together. And the communication has to come in multiple different forms of, good written communication, providing lots of, like the ACIRF has provided this kind of regular practices document. Like those kinds of things are needed. And I think we'll next community of research computing or cyber infrastructure professionals that are coming in. Like that onboarding process will be much more comprehensive when we have these types of documents available. But it's also important to provide communication to the researchers as well. And then to solve complex problems. Researchers a lot of times are coming into the environment, with a specific science knowledge, but maybe not able to translate that to the technical things that are needed in order to, so solving complex problems. If a person in the role of facing the researcher has dealt with numerical methods and some of those types of things in the past, they may be able to understand how those would fit in different regimes, whether is something more appropriate to do it in R or Python, or is it more appropriate to do this on HPC versus some type of cloud environment. Like those are really important things to help. And those are really complex, like when you're starting to build a whole workflow with somebody. So those are kind of the four big themes from the researcher facing that the group's pulled out. And they overlap a lot with each other. And there was also a lot of overlap with, at different institutions, the concept of the researcher facing role may also take a lot of, and do a lot of other things. And one of those that we found a lot of overlap with was the software and data facing. So the software and data facing figure is a little different style. And I think the way to look at this would be that there is data and there's software in the middle of this as kind of the target. And how you deal with that, maybe through different means that are here in the red. So the workflow design, our data wrangling, visualization, curation, archival, and preservation of data, documentation. And depending on what, so these are kind of the functions that are on the edge of the dotted line, right? The system administrative role, may play if you're trying to design something new, and say the workflow and design or the data backend was going to be different. If it was going to be a Hadoop backend versus just a flat file system, that would involve a more system admin role. Software engineering role, if we're having to design the software to do some of these things like visualization. Security and compliance, if it's around different types of data, and training, that's pretty obvious. So these outer parts that say domain, the idea is that if you were standing on the outskirts of this, and this was a lens, this would be your lens for your domain. So if you were in sociology and you looked into data and software, different parts of this would be more important to you than the others. If you were down here in the bottom right and you were, say, an astrophysicist, right, and using microscope data, if you're over on the left and you're looking at public health, right, like security and compliance, those different things would have different weight, and the ways in which you would do visualization or documentation may change. So that was kind of the idea of this figure, is that, and I think that particularly makes a difference if you're in the data and software facing role, and you may have a particular discipline that your background that you come from, or the background that you're currently supporting. These things might be, quite a bit different. So we want people to understand that, like using this kind of figure. And so there are a lot of different bullet points in the document itself underneath some of these big themes. And then the group that was looking at sponsor and stakeholder facing roles, the first thing that they thought of is, like, if you're the CI leader, who are your stakeholders? Who are the sponsors? And so these are a list of the different stakeholders or sponsors. Like, as a leader, your staff, like, you have relationship with them that's important. You may have the professors and the places that you provide the service to, but you also may have other places that bring in funds for this endeavor. So what they said is, if I take this leadership and I'm looking at the stakeholder, there's different functions that you need to be responsible for. And the functions are these bubbles around. So education, leadership, sustainability, stakeholder, benchmarking, or just metrics, I should say, and the workforce. As this these different stakeholders on the outside of the CA leadership, each of these bubbles would have different weights. So that's what the next series of slides shows you. So if you're institutional leadership, they may think that the assessment and the metrics and the sustainability are really important, and the long-term vision, but they're probably less concerned with things like the actual workforce and what you do for education and communication to maybe the researchers. If you're an end user, like if you're looking at the researchers themselves, how you're managing and doing all of the services and how you're promoting and doing the education of that are probably more important to them than your actual workforce, right? So that's just an example. They had a few different ones of those to give an example. So it's similar as the other ones. So these are, like I talked before, some other common themes outside of kind of the planned workshop to create the document, we kept track of. And so this concept of co-creation or partnering with researchers was really important. I think we spent at least 30 minutes having a debate about what this meant and how different institutions were doing this differently. I know Henry always is clear about making us remember that, to the researcher and to sometimes their administrative side of things, it is their currency, right, would be publications and grants. And so if we participate in that community with publications and grants within our own departments, I think that provides a lot more ability for this idea of co-creation, that we are stewards of resources and creating methodology that can coalesce at the same time with what they're trying to do on their research endeavors. And the concept of career path, or really just the lack thereof, and how there's a very incomplete understanding of what a career path would look like. A lot of it's really challenging because the organizations are always pretty small. It's not like there's other places on campus that you would go to. You're not going to necessarily jump from research computing into, enterprise IT or, some of those kinds of things. Like that's, you could, but I'm just saying like that's a different type of career. And so the career paths are not defined most places, which I think is a little bit challenging and frustrating, knowing that faculty come to a university with a predefined career track. They know that there's certain accolades and requirements they have to do to apply for tenure and then to go to a full professor. They don't have to like jump between different departments like on campus, right? And so I think that's where the relationship in the kind of the class difference between faculty and staff and students is it's pretty obvious that there's a difference. But how do we build some other type of structure that's somewhat similar? And that also doesn't exist just in research computing. It exists for people who are, very technical and very research savvy that have staff positions, maybe in instrumentation lab, like sequencing and stuff like that. Another thing is that the fact that our term for these digital technologies, right, that's at the bottom, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. The terminology for what we mean is not even consistent between our schools and between different, so like the cyber infrastructure term, research computing, high performance computing, data science, those terms don't mean the same thing in the same places. And I think once we align some of what the roles and responsibilities are, the next step would be to start talking and framing up more what we mean about the terminology. The understanding that the digital growth of technologies is a challenge, and it's growing in all sorts of different ways, and that there's starting to become more of an overlap in some of the space with the concept of data itself. That digital scholarship, I should say, is just becoming a larger portion of academic life, and it's starting to overlap into the libraries very strongly and other places that are outside of what would be normally the Department of Research Computing types of purview. And then the status I already kind of mentioned, right? And kind of like a two-tiered culture. So those are kind of some other major themes that came about. So I think you'll notice, and the things I've talked about thus far, nowhere have I talked about labeling the names and purposefully shied away from, because that becomes a big challenge. Because if you think about a person, you think about what their title is, we may have a variety of different ways that we would describe that as a title. But I think it was much clearer of an approach to go through and think about what are the roles and responsibilities, and think about what is the major class of types of things that they're doing. And that's where the facing roles and responsibilities came from. So we have a living document, which means that this thing will get updated in some regular fashion, and that we would really like feedback. So on the CARC website, so I was going to switch and see if I can. I think I'm only sharing my, let me share a different screen now. Chrome browser. All right, so now you see my browser. Okay, so this is the CARC webpage, and if you go to current committees, this is the workforce committee, and when you click on this link, it brings up the guide. There's another document I'm just going to tell you about, that the stakeholder and value proposition has also created another document. So this is what the guide looks like. And so each of them are broken up into this job elements, sections, education, experience and skills, professional development, and career opportunities. And there's also a guide of how to understand where did this document come from, how did we go about with the framework. There's the major themes that I just talked about. So you guys are all welcome to read this in more detail. And it talks about kind of the aim and the overall thing that I just talked about. And really, we're hoping that you can use this document to either write job descriptions off of these roles and responsibilities, to work with HR, and and when you're trying to create positions so that they understand that there's kind of a bigger body of work that's behind this besides than just yourself and your own thoughts, which I think is normally the case that a lot of us have been into when we try to create a new position. And you know, if you have any suggestions behind the document, we're always happy to see that. And in that website, it shows you how to do the suggestions and stuff. So here's what I was trying to show you. Like, there's the terminology that I just gave you for the researcher facing, and then here's a lot of bullet points of things underneath. And so there's that for each one of those statements. And then the next section is the part that I didn't really have in the slides, is kind of some loosely agreed upon background and experience that we would think that a person that would come into this role would have. And this might change. You can kind of pick and choose these depending on the type of position that you're trying to create. And then here's a list of skills and competencies that we think that you should consider using when building a job description, or even just when you're interviewing and trying to look at those people. And then the last part is the career opportunities. And so for researcher facing, you can see some language about the virtual residency program that you're in now. And then there's the, some other documentation, like I mentioned, the leading practices. And then other types of organizations that you may look, that might also have either workshops or symposiums and birds of a feather type of things around these topics. So let's switch back to my, I think, yeah, that was it for my slides. So I'm happy to have a dialogue about this. If you have any questions, get some feedback from you would be great to have as well. I want to make sure you knew where the document was at so you could use it. Anyone?
I have a question.
Hang on, I gotta unmute this. Oh, you, okay, go ahead. Go ahead,
Okay.
loud.
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, you cannot. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right. You can hear. Go ahead.
Sorry. So contributing, it would be very interesting to further contributing to the documents. I was at the workshop in March. So I'm not so sure at the moment what is the plan, how to distribute it further, that more people can contribute, because I know that we somehow discussed that we first have something in the community, then we lighten the access up. So is it now something we can forward to people? How is the plan now?
So yeah, so I just showed you the document. Let me go back to changing. This document is publicly available on the CARC website. So carc.org, go to committees, and then under each committee, there's a link to the documents that they've produced. So yes, you can take this document, and if you have any questions or any comments or whatever, you can just email those directly into help@carc.org. So if there's things that you think need to be changed, or if you have suggestions for what should be next, we're always welcome to hear all that. There's a meeting in a couple of weeks where we're going to set the stage for what we're going to do for the upcoming year for the different working groups. So one follow-on thing that somebody's already asked me to do, that which I'm happy to do, is provide. I'm going to try to provide like a 4 or 5 slide deck online that people can use if they want to go, because it's not likely that you're going to take I think this is, yeah, 25-page document and send it to somebody like an upper administration if you're trying to have a conversation around this. What we need is something that's like either a single page or maybe like 5 slides that can be talking points you can use. So that's kind of one of the things that needs to be done. And then the next step would be, we didn't have a huge amount of HR involvement, and it would be nice to have like something more like 50% HR involvement with creating the next stage of this, which would be, can we create some mock-up job descriptions and stuff, and create a hierarchy of positions, and based upon skills, and I think that's the style. It looks like a grid. That's the style of things that HR is accustomed to. So I think that would be the next stage. It would be more useful for people to take. Maybe all the other work would be collecting a whole bunch of different job descriptions. I actually have some summer students that don't know this. That's what they're doing all next week. I'm going to forward them like 100 emails that we get from all these lists, and we're going to try to catalog a lot of job titles, job descriptions, so we can see what people are currently doing. But I think it would also be nice to know people who have used this document to create job descriptions, what they've done with it more particularly, because that's kind of one of an outcome from the work. So hopefully that gives you an idea of kind of the trajectory of what's going to happen in this space for the workforce development.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Go ahead.
That sounds great. The other idea, so I like the HR idea. The other idea would be also to involve more faculty who are not in the space. Yeah, get feedback, because they also have to support these positions. So is there another step in that direction planned?
We haven't thought of that direction, but I think it would be good to get some focus group type of feedback from what are our stakeholders, and the faculty is a big part of that. So yeah. Any other?
Shout out your question. You want me to?
Yeah. So first, thanks, Scott, for this. And so I shared this document when it was sent, I think, on the champions list, about maybe 9 days HR, but it didn't show, and like I didn't get any response or anything. It's more like that. So is there a way to motivate people like in these positions to look at this? Or?
I mean, you're at New Mexico, is that right? Yeah. I think so. There's kind of a critical time point of when the current job descriptions that you have and stuff, that kind of stuff gets outdated, and when there becomes a situation where you're trying to do something more or grow new positions, and they just don't coincide with anything else that exists on campus, and it becomes a really big problem. So just an example of what's happened at Harvard in the greater IT community, and this is what's caused there to be like an IT job family framework like rehash, is so in Harvard there's about 1,200 total IT positions across all the different colleges and stuff. So in that, as an example, the business titles, there were like 35 different positions that in the business title said something with the word security or compliance. And there's no IT job family with security, which means that they have just generic thing called IT specialist. All of my staff, for the most part in research computing, which is not part of central IT, they're all called IT specialists. What we do, job functionally, is very, very different. And the IT security people would do stuff that is fairly different than other random groups that are lumped into this IT specialist. So the real problem becomes is if you're doing something that's really complicated, or it's complicated and has a really broad scope like research computing does, you're not being treated equivalently in your job code to other people who don't have that responsibility. So then when you try to say, well, I think there's an inequity in pay compared to what I think these people would be paid if they worked somewhere else or something like that. When HR does is they compare, right, number of years you've been there, the number of years in the position, and this job family that you're in across the spectrum. And if that spectrum is not correct, you could already be on the top end skew of that spectrum. And it really, I think, it provides a very poor way to, make good decisions around those types of things. It also doesn't properly define trajectory normally because there's not an established trend of progressive positions within that family. It doesn't mean you would necessarily have a position at each different level in each different track, but I think at least you could go to HR if you had a person that you wanted to hire and they were, say, above the level that you posted, you could at least point out that, like, look, this person meets the next level up of this position and stuff. So does that provide you some decent, I mean, that's my take on it. I think it's hard to just force it down HR's throat, but I mean, the HR, like from Eric Newman's at Florida, and I can't remember the lady's name at New Mexico. I mean at Minnesota. Anyways, but the one thing that they said that was really valuable is that they were using the Mercer study of IT job positions. It's a pretty large, national study that you like pay a pretty good amount of money for. Once they were able to tie the roles that their staff had to something else external from their institution, they had a lot more traction with HR when it came to, creating these job codes around these different positions. They had something to tie it to. And I think that was the biggest takeaway that they told us, is that would be something that would be really valuable, is if we had a larger body of work. And this is, I think, what sets us apart now. A lot of professional societies do this. When I was a part of the American Chemical Society, there's a really, really well-defined thing and a national survey and all this about what position you're in, how much you're paid, how many years have you been in it. So there's a lot of that kind of information that's available. And we just don't have that. And so it makes it very difficult for us to justify anything outside of, when you're in your university, they can only look at other positions because there's nothing else nationally to look at. So. Any other questions?
Oh, okay. Scott, can you hear right now?
Yes.
Okay, so there was a question from out in Zoom land. Weren't the next steps going to be HR matrices to help institutions bridge this work to actual job descriptions and job families? Sounds like you've talked about that some. Can you maybe flesh it out a little more?
Yes. So that is the next goal, is to decide. I mean, that would be the next logical step, is to do that. And I think when we meet in a couple of weeks, it will be trying to decide on how we should go about doing that. Who should be involved? Because that's exactly what the HR, I think, needs, is to see that already done. And then each institution can take some kind of framework like that and modify it to how they need. But at least they won't start from scratch when they're doing that. That part becomes a little tricky because necessarily agreeing on that level of detail becomes more, I think, difficult. It also means we're going to start writing in job titles to all of these. So that's where some of the language and terminology, if it's pretty loose around what we mean a person is at one institution versus the other, I think that's where we'll have more struggle getting kind of wider adoption. But I think that HR matrices is exactly what is needed.
Another question from out in Zoom land. On a separate track, are there any thoughts on some mini box for each facing? Book of knowledge. So software engineering book of knowledge. I'm not sure what the other ones are, but project management book of knowledge and so on. Is there a thought about creating such books of knowledge for each of the four facings?
So we kind of have one for, I think there'll be more like within the facings, there may be a couple different ones. For example, the researcher facing one, there is a facilitation kind of leading practices for research software engineering, which is like a part of like the researcher, the software facing, and one for data science. There may be like, those are starting to become kind of their own, mini disciplines, I would say. There are, just to say, many areas of practice that I think there will be that. I think in Europe, like especially in the UK and some other places, they're a little ahead of us a couple of years with regards to the research software engineering. And there's a really good paper that they've published around that. And I think it does a really good job of describing the role of a research software engineer and how it's different and than just a software engineer, maybe the business analytics or for administrative application type stuff. And it also talks about there's some really good anecdotal stories in that thing. I think that are really powerful as well. And of course, Bob Freeman just posted, because he did a lot of work on that with the ACI ref leading practices in the Zoom chat. Another thing that I know from talking to the group at Exceed, like John Towns had mentioned in their little box that they had about all the different Exceed, there's different services that they have that are beyond just providing compute and storage for people. And they're going to produce a pretty extensive white paper around systems engineering when it comes to like the larger scale. And I think that kind of will be a nice benefit, but I think there's a lot of people's personal preference when it comes to some of the systems engineering stuff. But I think it would be nice to start getting those things together. And those, like we have the Linux Cyber Institute, like there's that exists. Some of these are more like workshops and not really full on, like written guides. So I think that's part of the situation. I think in this concept of facilitators having a written guide, I don't think the concept of facilitating research is going to change too dramatically over the course of the decades. We're still going to be helping researchers, and there's a lot of things that are a part of that are not technology, like tied to specific technology. But hopefully that answers some of that. There's some of that, but it's just not maybe not as organized yet as it could be. And I think that's part of the thing is by not having a centralized professional society, we have a bunch of different groups that are trying to do a lot of this work. I think for newcomers into it, they don't know maybe where to look.
So Scott, during your answer, you mentioned something that my brain got stuck on, and that I'd like to maybe dive a little deeper into, which is you mentioned explaining to, for example, HR people, and I think it goes beyond that. I think it goes to institutional officers and so on, the difference between regular software engineering and research software engineering. And it occurs to me that that's something that would be very valuable across all of the different roles, and not, I think in each case, so for example, system administration for research computing, I think is very different from typical enterprise system administration, because it tends to cover a much broader set of areas of interest and a much longer task list than a typical enterprise systems person might cover. And so it would be very interesting, I think, to have that sort of information in an easily digestible form, not for the benefit of the research computing community, but for the benefit of decision makers who often have very little exposure to research computing, and especially to the ways that research computing is different from all other kinds of computing.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's kind of like twofold of what this job family elements and career guide kind of think can be used for. It's not necessarily written specifically for that, but I think you bring out a good point, is that it would be nice to provide, like, so there's groups of us that have been doing this for a long time and have kind of fought this battle and have some pretty good body of knowledge of what are more successful ways to communicate that. And I think writing that out is kind of an introduction of why the researcher facing job roles are particularly unique, and how they affect research as a whole, and why they're valuable, and what sets that person apart from other aspects, and do that for each one of them. In the systems engineering space is the one, or I should say the systems facing roles, is the one that is particularly interesting, because there is a portion of this that really overlaps a lot with enterprise IT, as far as at the crux of provide network, you provide servers, you provide storage. So kind of at a base level, there's a lot of that I think are really hard for some people to see the difference in. And so it'd be really important to pull those out. If you were a really small college and you had enterprise IT, you could have a small staff where they had to be diverse. I'm trying to be like the devil's advocate on all this, to write on the system side, because I want to make sure we do a really clear job of describing the difference in enterprise IT versus the other. And I don't think of it as, I try to think of it less as everything with it, and you have a big staff and your staff is all specialized. Because if you turn to somewhere like NCSA, right, they're a really, really big staff, right? There's like 300 and something of them. And so they all individually specialize, very much like an enterprise IT. But I think one of the differences is the things that they're providing in a research computing space are on the leading edge and somewhat experimental, and the ways in which you engage and have to deploy that kind of infrastructure is profoundly different. And I think that's like how to pull that apart in each of these kind of things is particularly important. It's
So
yeah.
another comment from, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said, yeah, I agree with what you said. I just was trying to give some further thought to it. But yeah, what's the next comment?
Yeah. Okay, so there have been at least a couple of papers written by EDUCAUSE folks to at least address some of the unique issues of research networking. And so now my own follow-up comment to that, I think that's exactly right. And I think the ESNet folks, the Department of Energy folks, have done a very good job of both explaining the difference between research networking and enterprise networking, and making a compelling case for institutions and federal research funding agencies to invest in research networks at the institution level. And that's where the Campus Cyber Infrastructure Program at the NSF grew out of. So that suggests that there's maybe something we can learn from those folks on how to both articulate what the differences are and then make a case for treating them as different and significant.
Right. And it's nice to see that those kinds of things written via EDUCAUSE. But yeah, I mean, I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to take some really well-respected people in the community to stand up and say, this is different because of this, and it provides this utility. And so like Dana kept harping on the fact that, like, there was a time when librarians had to do this, right? And then eventually they won their case on a campus, right? And I think we're kind of at that point where we have to. I mean, the other thing is, like, what, maybe 15 years ago, the number of universities that actually had this as a department were pretty small, and we're only getting to the point now where almost every school has some kind of department that's doing this. So it's definitely, the time is right for something like that, where we stand up and do it in a couple of different lights. You know, not just, I think we need to explain it more thoroughly, and go to the places, you know, because like, for instance, if you go to the concept of the facilitator is not something they're normally thinking about, right? They understand what software engineer is. They understand what people who run hardware, but the concept of facilitator is very foreign to that group. They don't normally do that. They just answer, you know, questions about the service and they're done. When they write software, they go and get a list of requirements. They come back and do it, and they're done. They don't build and evolve with the researcher and the person how to do this better themselves later. So cool. Any other questions?